Good morning, everyone. I'm Ziwu Chen, Chen Zhiwu, at the University of Hong Kong. So welcome to this Quantitative History Webinar series again. I hope all of you had a great summer break. For us here at Hong Kong U, now we're all back to a full swing of the new academic year. So as such, we're very happy to resume our quantitative history webinar series. So today we're really thrilled to have Professor Wolfgang Keller to share his new work on intergenerational mobility of daughters and marital sorting, new evidence from Imperial China. So, by way of background, Professor Keller is a professor of economics at the University of Colorado in this cold mountain state in the US. So he is well known for his work on international trade and investment, economic development, technological change, productivity, and especially economic history. So he has worked very extensively on Chinese economic history with his wife and colleague, Professor Carol Shiue, on various different topics. So both of them are very well known in the relatively small circle of Chinese economic history. So Professor Keller, together with his wife and others, has published very extensively in the American Economic Review, JPE, and other top economics as well as non-economics journals. So he received his PhD in economics from the famous Yale University back in 1995. So today we also are very thrilled to have Professor Hao Dong to be our invited discussant on the talk. So Professor Dong is a sociologist by training and also by his professional research track record. He is an assistant professor at the Center for Social Research at the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University. So he got his PhD from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology back in 2016 with research on social demography, social stratification and inequality, as well as comparative historical demography, especially he has worked extensively to understand how family and social context shaped demographic differentials and socioeconomic inequality. So before I spend too much time on the introduction, let me also very quickly remind everyone about the format. So Professor Keller will give a talk for about 1 hour, and then my colleague, Professor Zhichen Ma, will take it on to moderate the discussion by Professor Dong, and then Q&A. So if you have any questions while the presentation and the discussion are going on, please post your questions in the Q&A box, and then Professor Ma will select some questions for Professor Keller to address. So the whole event will last for 1 hour and a half. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Keller. Wolfgang, okay. Unmuted. Okay, good.
Thanks very much, Ziwu and Chicheng, for organizing this seminar. Thanks to everybody who's coming. And as Ziwu was saying, this is joint work with Carol Shiue, who's also at the University of Colorado. Is this good? Do we see the screen? Then I'm assuming yes, we just tried it out. This is a new paper. That's the first time we're presenting this. So the comments that you might have, they will be particularly useful for this research because it's just so new. A starting point of this research is to think about women in world history and what kind of economic functions women had. And so that ranges from animal husbandry in the agricultural sector over household crafts production. And of course, since the earliest of times, it involved also raising children. But if we're thinking about women's economic status and what we know about women's economic status, that's largely a black box. It's a question mark. We don't really know very much about it. And so natural question to ask is why this is. Is it just that brains are less important or harder to measure than brawn? And so female status is harder to measure than male. So we're interested in this, and it turns out that one reason for sure why this is the case has to do with the relatively low female labor participation rate in the formal labor market. I have here a statistic, an estimate for the United States in the year 1890, and the number is about 19% of the females were in the formal labor market. For married women, this number is smaller. So it turns out that many of these economic functions of women that I have here on the left side are in-house, in household, within household. So that's not transacted on any kind of labor market. Therefore, we have a hard time measuring women's status because there's no labor earnings data. So that's clearly one important part. Now, and that's about the status of women per se, but if we're thinking about the change in economic status of women, so we're starting to think about women's intergenerational mobility, that's also tends to be pretty difficult to do because women, at least in many countries, in many societies, they tend to change their name upon marriage. And so what that means that if you're using something like a census data set, which is a cross-sectional snapshot of who's living at a particular point in time, then that cross-sectional data set will maybe give you the parent and the daughter connected in one family, but then you have to find the daughter in another cross-sectional snapshot maybe 30 years later, and that tends to be difficult. And so it's challenging to find, quote unquote, women in that next cross-sectional data set. So one approach to this is then to just say, well, let's say the status of women, the status of a woman is that of her husband. So one limitation of that approach, which has been taken, which you can take and which has something, to be recommending for, is that you will be limiting your analysis to married women. So you're going to ignore women that do not have a married husband. But you could say in societies like China in particular, in historical times where marriage rates are close to universal, that's a risk that you would take. You would just say, okay, I'm going to forget about the 1 or 2% of women that are unmarried. So I think that what we think is a more serious limitation is that if you identify the economic status of a woman with that of her husband, then it's impossible to distinguish marriage from other factors that affect intergenerational transmission. And so we don't want to do this. And so here's the way we are going to approach this in this particular data. So as I said, there's two major issues of why we can assess the economic status of women relatively with a lot of difficulty. And on the first one, no labor earnings data, that's going to be the same in our analysis. We do not have labor earnings data on the women in our sample from the 1500s to the 1900s. However, we're going to present, and we're going to try to convince you of original information on women's status, and that's based on the timing of their marriage. Now, on that second point, that women are difficult to trace from one generation to the next, that turns out to be not the case in our analysis, because we are going to use from the get-go a data set that has intergenerational connections built in, and they're longitudinal. So we are actually going to be having data that's from the get-go going to be having these intergenerational links. So we don't have to connect ex post cross-sectional data sets. Okay, so that's where we're going here. So the topic in a nutshell is, what's the relationship of marriage with women's intergenerational mobility in Imperial China? And so we're actually going to study a very small part of China. So we're not starting all of Imperial China. We're also not going to talk about the entire country. We're going to produce here a micro-level analysis of individuals, households, and clans in one particular part of China, namely that's Tongzhen County, which is a county in Anhui province. And so here this map shows these little dots with these codes. Those are towns and villages in Tongzhen County. You see here a couple of mountains in the northwest, and you see a couple of roads, major roads. And what you see in the lower right part of the picture is actually the Yangtze River. So this county is close to Anqing, the capital of Anhui. It's about 60 kilometers by 100 kilometers, and estimates suggest that in the year 1790, the total population was in the order of 1.5 million people. Now, the sample that we are having from this area is going to be mostly father-daughter pairs for the Qing dynasty, but the range of the sample is from the early 1500s to the early 1900s. Now, that being the sample period, what's true is that for this sample period, there is no good official data yet. So what do I mean by official data? Something like state collected, country level, federal collected data, broad, something like what we would call a census today. So the green line that I have here is the best official data that we have for Tongzhen County during this time. It's based on tax records called the registered population. And you see that over this period of more than 400 years, I have heroically connected these. So we have 21 data points, so we don't really have annual data on this population. In addition, what you see is that from the late 15th century to the early 17th century, the official data suggests that there has been hardly any population change. At the same time, when our clan records, and that's the data on the bottom, that blue line, when our clan records actually indicate sustained population growth at some pretty close to linear rate. So the bottom line is the officially available data is at a minimum incomplete, maybe it's flawed. And so what we're going to actually do is we're going to use family records, clan records, which is what the lower series is based on. That allows us to get actually a population estimate of that sample, not of Tongzhen overall, but of that sample for every year during this time. Okay, so the data source then is Chinese family genealogies. Now, these genealogies, Chinese genealogies, This is a classic source of socio-economic data in China that is going to be familiar to most people in the audience, but let me just remind you, genealogies, they provide a patrilineal list of individuals and couples, with the main purpose being to provide a family history which has ritual significance. But let me point out that these genealogies have also major economic functions, in particular in the area of property rights, in the area of taxation and public goods, but also in some other areas. And because they have these economic functions and it's costly for the family, for the clan, I'm going to call that clan, but it's also called lineage or common descent group, for the clan to produce these genealogies, you would think that their information in the genealogies tends to be accurate. Okay. Now, a principle of Chinese genealogies is that all males by default are clan members, whereas females are members upon in-marriage. And we want to be mindful of the fact that not all clans have genealogies. And so I'm going to talk about selection in a couple of minutes. Now, when you're thinking about what kind of data is in such a genealogy, well, that varies. We believe currently that there's between 50,000 and 100,000 Chinese genealogies out there, closer to 100,000, I would think. But nobody has actually so far done, a comprehensive analysis of, seeing how they could be used for quantitative work. But for basic purposes here, we can think of the genealogy as something like an annotated family tree. So there's additional information in the family tree. Think of the basic nodes in the family tree as a marriage or some kind of a partnership between a male and a female. And then there's additional information in that. So the basic element in this, it tends to be a couple, that's the node. And for practical purposes, tends to be recorded in the extant Chinese family genealogies are not family trees, some kind of big picture, but for practical purposes, it tends to be a list, more or less a list over pages where every line is essentially one generation. So here's an example from one of the genealogies that we're using of the Zhou lineage. So you can get a flavor of what the layout is and what kind of information is in there. And it's from these types of sources that our data set essentially is culled. Now, the information is, in particular, demographic information, vital statistics, in particular, the birth and the death, marriage and children. We have also just seen this here. And so you have on the left information on the man of the couple, and then in the middle, we have some information on females and so forth. So what we're actually using of this is not just the vital information, the information on marriage, potentially multiple female partners, as well as children. But what's key, of course, for a study of intergenerational mobility is information on status. Okay. Now, the status comes in two types. The status of husbands is going to be the maximum lifetime social status, and I'm going to show you this. And for women, it's going to be the status, and that's going to be based on whether the woman was the first or a subsequent, or perhaps only an only wife. And so out of these two status variables, the women's status is less standard. And so let me go to this right away and also spend some more time on it. It turns out the information on male status is not that original. Okay, so our hypothesis on women's status, and so this is here the part where we're proposing some original status information on women, given that we don't have labor earnings data and things, and we don't have the equivalent information as we have for males. And so the hypothesis is going to be that women who marry first, and that's in a temporal sense, they have higher status. So the argument is going to be eventually that the temporal first marriage is associated with also higher status on average. So where is this idea coming from? Now, if you take the economic analysis of marriage, it thinks of the bride and groom that are being brought together by the respective families, that they are kind of thinking about choices that they can make in something like a marriage market. So marriage market, very economics here, demand, supply. And so each of these families with their bride and their groom, they have many different choices. And the equilibrium choice, the choice that they will actually then make, that depends on expected marital output. Expected marital output. So this is, in a way, it's a productive production endeavor, marriage. And so what's the marital output of a marriage? Well, it includes, for sure, a certain quantity and quality of children. And that could involve different gender. It could involve different levels of skill. In particular, marital output is high if the offspring, let's say the son of that marriage, has relatively high skills and achieves high status in his future life, because then he will actually carry on high status of the family. And so what's the contribution of the man, and what's the contribution of the groom, what's the contribution of the bride to that endeavor? Now, the mother of this child would typically be the first teacher. In childhood, in the first couple of years, she would be there. So during the sample period that we're studying, there's not going to be any major forms of schooling. To the extent that there is schooling, this will take place at home. And so the woman will be very involved in that. So her contribution then to this marital output is that effective teacher time. Think about it this way. And so then she's going to be a good choice or a bad choice or an attractive choice, let's put it this way, if she's good at that. And she will be good at that when she comes from a highly educated family. And so that's how this works. Okay, so then the argument in the paper in this presentation here is that the expected marital output of a marriage with the first wife will be higher than with a later wife. And that's mostly by what economists call revealed preference. We observe out of multiple marriages, and they typically occur sequentially, not simultaneously. But we observe that one of these wives has been chosen first. And so we then infer that that must be the better wife that can contribute more to marital output, and think of it as she's going to be the better teacher of the offspring. Okay, and so that is actually also historically making sense, and it makes sense in the sample because the age difference between the first wife and the later wife in our sample is not very high. It's between 4 and 5 years. So these women will actually be simultaneously alive, but one of them is then chosen as the first wife, whereas the other is chosen as a later wife. Now, there's also women in this marriage market. There's a lot of couples, in fact, a large majority of couples in our sample, where a man is marrying only one wife during his entire lifetime. We're going to refer to them as the single wives or single lifetime wives. And so you can show with a little bit of algebra that the expected marital output of a marriage involving a first wife, one out of multiple sequentially, must be higher than the expected marital output of a husband with a single wife. And that's because it's easiest to think about that the marriage market has different segments. So there's the segment, the sort of the high quality segment of the marriage market. And so a high status family with their bride, they will go to the high end part of the marriage market because they are trying to get a groom that comes from a attractive family, and that kind of family is quite likely going to be a multiple female partner over the lifetime of the man household. Okay, so then whereas a family with a somewhat less attractive, less quality, high quality bride, they will go to the part of the marriage market where mostly there's going to be single wives, single lifetime wives. One has to take into account here that the marriage is a very expensive affair during this time in China, and most of these, and I think that's still true, and most of these men will not have the resources for more than one wife. So bottom line, families self-select in a particular part of the marriage market, and we can expect that those with particularly attractive and very able brides are going into the more higher end part of the market. Now, with these kinds of, and so you ask yourself, if this is economic theory, is there any evidence in the history, from historical accounts that that's really the case? And so one argument is that we know from work by historians that the second or subsequent wife in a household is frequently in a very precarious situation because she has to deal with the resentment of the stepchildren. And those are the children of the first wife. And if there's a male among these children, then that male actually has higher status than the second wife. Okay, and so you will not have very attractive matches getting themselves into this kind of position. And so that's one piece of evidence. We can also push this and ask whether in our sample we have evidence that first wife marriages involve women with higher status. And that's what I'm showing here. If we're contrasting, and so the left is 13%, that's the lower right here, 13% of the marriages involve first wives, 87% not first wives. So I have these first wives on the right, on the left, and on these non-first wives on the right. And so what we see from this picture here is that the husbands that first wives are married to have a higher status on average than the husbands of non-first wives. Okay, so for example, so a husband's status is a variable that ranges from 1 to 4. 1 is low, 4 is high. We see that these first wife marriages, they have 65% or so, they are with husbands of lowest status. However, for these non-first wife marriages, 87% are with husbands with the lowest status. Conversely, for higher status levels, so status levels 3 and 4 in particular, they barely exist in among these marriages that involve non-first wives. Whereas there are there's a serious number of them for these first wives. So that's evidence in the sense that we can think of this as a validation of that a first wife really has relatively high status. She has high status in the sense that she tends to be married to a husband whose status distribution dominates the husband's status distribution of non-first wives. So that's one piece of evidence. But you can also see here of course, that if we had assumed, if we just had assumed that the status of a married wife is identical to that of her husband, that's not true. That this is not a black and white situation. So we would make a mistake if we make this assumption. There are certainly a good number of wives that are not first wives, and still they have a relatively high status husband. Okay, so but this is the first piece of evidence for our original information on women status. The second is that we find stronger marital sorting for first wife marriages. It turns out that the correlation between the biological family status and the in-law family status for first wife marriages is 66%. It's positive, so there's positive marital sorting, and it's 66%. Whereas for non-first wife marriages, it's only 56%. So it's 10 percentage points lower. Now, the degree of marital sorting is an indicator of the marriage search costs. And if you have higher search costs, that goes hand in hand with a higher importance of that marriage or a higher status of that particular bride. Okay, so these are two pieces of evidence that go with our assumption here, that support this assumption. Now let's move to male status. Male status is based on around 30 descriptors of lifetime achievements of these men directly coming from these genealogies. Now, an important part of these descriptors has to do with certain degrees at the local, provincial, or national level in the civil service exam, and also official positions that these men have achieved. But not only. And so I have here a selection of the most important of these descriptors. And so we have then the male status is going to be coming in a categorical variable with levels 1 to 4. Let's start with the lowest, with the highest status. Highest status in our classification, those would be graduates of the National Civil Service Exam, specifically the Civil Jinchi. And that accounts in our sample for 0.4%, relatively small number of people, very exclusive. Civil juran, those would be the graduates at the provincial civil service exam. They add another 1.4, and so that's a total of 1.8% of the total for these two very high level status classes. Now, the large majority of the sample is this category 1, which we have in the first row here. 84.2% of our sample men belong to this, and so the remainder is class 2 with 14. You might say that you have only 4 different status levels. Why don't we use more? Or, I'm familiar with modern intergenerational income studies. They use the dollar amount or something like that. Well, there's virtually no study that I'm familiar with that has information on individual level income or wealth for these people. So we're going to do this by class. And we have here a distinction into 4 different classes, but typically most studies of historical episodes that I'm familiar with, they would have only 2, namely 0, no status, and some level of status. So we have here already some a bit more gradation, although admittedly not that much. And we're going to use the same male status classification for 5 different types of males. They are the son, the father-in-law, paternal and maternal grandfather. So for all 5 of them, we are going to be able to use the same classification. Now, another important part is how we are creating the sample and what are its characteristics. So the explicit goal of the analysis is to create a representative sample or something close to a representative sample. Now, we are unable, as I said earlier, we are unable to match our sample to data for all of Tongzhen or all of China, because we don't have yet for this period official broadly representative data, but we have some information on some part of China, let's say for what's the typical fraction of educated population. And Chang says that that's about 2% have this local degree or the provincial degree. That's 2%. And another estimate is that the upper class, some kind of a broader upper class, may be around 20% of the population, according to Fei. Now, how do we create our sample? It turns out for Tongzhen, there's more than 60 genealogies that people are aware of right now. We don't have access to all of them, but we do eventually keep 7 clans. We dropped 32 in the process of creating our sample in order to avoid excess sampling of elites. And we end up having about a 3.2% Shengyuan fraction in the sample. We have roughly 15% of the sample with signs of higher status. And roughly 70% are actually commoners, in the sense that there's no sign of status in the genealogy of any kind of status whatsoever. And so this would be a very low income or wealth. And that's consistent with what we know for this part of China during the sample period. Okay, so here are the clans that we're going to work with. It's 7 different clans. These clans are different in size as well as in status. I have it here. The largest clan is the Wang, a relatively rich clan in a scale of 0 to 22. The Ma clan averages has an average of 7. Another relatively high status clan are the Yi. And so these differences across clans, there are the fact that they're different in both in terms of size and in terms of the average status. That's very useful for our analysis, because we can use that cross-clan variation to assess potential biases, in particular wealth bias. Is it true in particular that relatively rich people, that the relatively rich are overrepresented in our sample? Now, this picture shows the clan size across these 7 clans on the horizontal axis, and it has some average for the clan. And those are 3 different types of averages, namely its status, the number of sons per man, and the number of female partners per man. And so these are the different colors. And so we see here 21 symbols, and we fit a regression line for these 2. And you see that there's no indication that relatively large clans are having that the relatively large clans are those that are relatively resource rich, okay, that have high status or high number of sons, high number of wives. All of these lines, all of these series are essentially flat. So there's no evidence for that cross-clan wealth bias. We can extend this analysis and ask, is it the case that recent clan success in some kind of temporal sense is actually associated with having a greater representation of this clan in the sample? This is called recall bias. And we're doing this here not with a plot, but with regression analysis. And you see that so lagged clan status, the average lagged clan status, does not predict the size of the clan in the sample. So there's no evidence for recall bias. We can also ask whether the relatively rich are overrepresented towards the end of the sample. That's is called survivor bias. And so we're asking whether in the early 19th century, if you can read the footnote here, whether, there's a disproportionately large share of the relatively rich clans that are there. And there's no evidence for survivor bias either. We can jump back to the inception of the genealogies and we can ask, is there progenitor bias in the sense that maybe they started producing their family history when there was a particularly noteworthy, a particularly rich person, and that would be a problem in some sense, because if the genealogy started with that very rich person and then it's downhill from there, then essentially the whole dynamics of status for this clan would actually be already determined. But it turns out that there's no evidence for this. So what I'm showing here is the average, the clan average status by generation. And you see that the highest status is not in the first or in the second generation. It tends to be more in the sixth or in the seventh generation. And so there's no evidence for that. So let me move on to the one sample restrictions we do need to make. It is the case that we don't have information on the father of the wife status for all of our sample. The total sample of these 7 clans is roughly 11,000 observations. We have that information only for about 6,100 of them. And so that's the top line here in this table. The N is 6,178. We don't have this information on the 5,200 others. Now, it turns out that we're computing all of our status variables. We're computing something called the percentile rank. And so on average, that's going to be we're computing the percentile rank because that percentile rank accounts for the size of these different status classes. And it also accounts for, in the way we're computing it, for changing income distribution over time. And so you see from the last column here that the average status of the wives is higher when we have information on her father's status compared to when we don't have this information. But quantitatively, the difference is relatively small. As you see, it's like 0.5 versus 0.49. And we can also address this, and I will show you these results if we have the time. We get the same qualitative results as we get with the unweighted sample when we re-weight, and that re-weighting basically undoes that selection on what drives the difference between these two subsamples here. Okay, so let me get to the summary on the estimation sample. I hope I've convinced you the sample is broadly representative for the sample is broadly representative for this time of place and place. A key reason for that is that once we choose a genealogy, we include all members, and we have quite different clans here. Some of them are relatively rich, others are quite poor, and so the mix of that gives us a broadly representative sample. And so let me now start to get some empirical results going. So we're going to study here intergenerational mobility. We're going to specifically study what's called relative mobility, and it involves a regression of the daughter's status on the left-hand side on her father's status, which is the key variable on the right-hand side. So IX indexes here the pair, so that's the father-daughter pair. T indexes the birth year of that female. F, the superscripts F and M, are the male and the female clans. So in this regression, we are particularly interested in this coefficient beta, beta 1, which is the intergenerational coefficient of the biological father. Now, the mobility is higher the closer is this beta 1 to 0. An easy way of seeing this is that if you were to estimate beta 1 equal to 0, it would mean that daughter status is essentially random. It's totally unrelated to the status of her father. So the higher is that beta, the higher is intergenerational persistence, the inverse of intergenerational mobility. Now, just as a reference point for historical samples, I've seen numbers for this beta between 0.2 and 0.8 if we have a father-son kind of sample. And so, but, you know, there's a wide range of these coefficients. In addition, we have in this regression birth year fixed effects, that's these mu t's. You can think of this if you think about the marriage market again, and keep in mind we have a very, you know, we have a long sample period of in the order of, it spans 400 years. And so this is one way of accounting for secular changes in status and shocks, as well as you can think of this as we're actually we're unifying the marriage market because we are conditioning on the birth year of every one of these women. In addition, in order to address endogeneity concerns, omitted variables, we have fixed effects for each of these male clans. And we have fixed effects for each of these female clans. So these are 135 from 135 different clans do these women marry into these 7 male clans. Good. So here's the first result. We see that the coefficient that beta 1 on father status is about 0.13. It's positive, so that says that daughter status is increasing in her father's status, and so that's I think a new result that we can say that somehow there's some kind of intergenerational status transmission from father to daughter all the way to the early 1500s in this particular part of China. We see that adding birth year effects does not change the coefficient by a whole lot. It stays at around 13%, but adding male and female clan fixed effects brings this coefficient down to about 10% from 13%. And so what this means is that focusing on within clan variation leads to more mobility. Another way of saying this is that clans are a force towards status persistence. So the clans do certain things, the origin from one clan versus another, think of it as one is a relatively rich, the other is a relatively poor clan, that generates persistence. That's actually a result that we have in other contexts as well. In particular, we see it if you look at race differences in intergenerational mobility for the United States. Now, the second result is one particularly exciting part of this work that I like is that we can actually look at different cohorts here in a very long sense. So we're going to look at really centuries. We look at all of the observations that have birth year before 1700. We look at the women that have birth years in the 18th century, and we have birth years in the 19th century. And so we don't have much data for that very early period before 1700. You see it here in the footnote. We have roughly 600 pairs for the relatively early period, but still the 600 allows us to do some quantitative analysis and get some standard errors and coefficients, and that's what we have here in the first row. And then there's about 2,800 in the 18th century and 2,700 pairs in the 19th century. Now, doing this by cohort shows some evidence for changes in mobility, and I'm going to talk about this some more in what follows. Now, we are proposing first wife as an original status on as an original variable on the status of women, but we can compare this with what some other people would do, namely approximate the woman's status by the status of her husband. So the results that you've seen already are on the left that uses first wife as the variable for women's status. The results on the right show husband. So what you notice is that if we're using the husband status, then the coefficients don't tend to be around 0.1 or 0.15. They are more in the order of 0.4 or 0.5 maybe. And so the level of these two is clearly different. Okay, we think of the level as being due to measurement error. What we're doing here is we're predicting the status of a woman with some categories that are relevant for men. And so you might just think of this as being an effective teacher to children is not the same, doesn't involve the same characteristics as becoming a Jinshi, which is that national civil service exam graduate. Another way of why there's measurement error and therefore these the coefficients seem to be compressed towards zero is that the first wife status variable is an indicator variable. It's 0 or 1, whereas I've shown you earlier for males we have 4 different levels of status. But if you look closely, you see that the level is not the same, but the patterns are the same. The patterns over time are the same. It's also true that including clan fixed effects lowers the point estimates. And what I can't show here, but we can go over this later, is that the implied marital sorting based on these 2 different measures of women's status is very close, very similar. Okay. Now, this here is the second key result that we have. We want to study the role for marriage for women's intergenerational mobility. So what you've seen so far is the first column here. That's when we introduce in this regression the variable that is the biological father status. Now, in the third, now here we have the biological father status as well as the father-in-law status. So we're using the status of the in-law family as assessing the importance of marriage for intergenerational mobility. Now, what you see in the third column is that marriage clearly matters for intergenerational mobility. Both of these fathers enter with a significant coefficient, biological and father-in-law. And if you do a simple calculation, you see that marriage, in the sense of the father-in-law variable, accounts for 40% of the total intergenerational transmission effect. We also see, and that's comparing the biological father status coefficient in the first column with the sum of the coefficients in the third, that accounting for marital sorting lowers mobility. In this particular case, it lowers it by 22%. Okay, and so that's also important because it basically means that if you don't account for marriage in your analysis of intergenerational mobility, then you will overestimate the mobility that's really there. And the implied status correlation, that's a simple calculation that one can make. The implied status correlation, so the degree of marital sorting between biological and in-law families, is about 62%, 0.62%. So just as a point of reference, if you're thinking about contemporaneous China, and you think about educational marital sorting, so meaning marital sorting based of woman and man, based on the educational level that they achieve, that number, 62%, is the same as what you get for the year 1970. So another perspective on this is that that status correlation in marriages in China has a very long history. Now, this here is now we can actually look at this importance of marriage for intergenerational mobility cohort by cohort. So the important thing to take away here is, so all of these numbers, they come from a single regression. So we have on the left-hand side the daughter status, and we have on the right-hand side 6 variables, 3 by cohort for biological father and 3 for father-in-law. And so the takeaway here is, if you look at the last column, that the gains from marrying into high status for these women, they fall. They fall over time. Like, this is a 15% coefficient, also significant, whereas it goes down to a statistical 0 in the 19th century. And another implication, once you do the calculation, is that over time, there is less marital sorting. So the status correlation between the biological and the in-law parents falls from 65 to 59%. And so that's consistent with less marriage search. And that may be, and that's consistent with the historical evidence, that there's fewer high-status men around, and that's because the civil service examination system started to decay. And if there's fewer high-status men around, then you will not invest so much on marrying your daughter well, because there is not that many of these high-status men around. Okay. Now, we can also get an additional perspective looking at male intergenerational mobility from the same sample, okay? And so that's now here, that's shown in this result here. So let's just focus on the third column here. We have also, for male intergenerational mobility, we have a substantial contribution from the in-law family. And and we also can back out from this from this table that the degree of marital sorting is somewhat lower for sons than for daughter, and that's the implied marital sorting that we're getting out of this intergenerational regression, and that's consistent with historical evidence that's out there that says that men marrying down was not that uncommon compared to what women would do, because men marrying down, the idea was that they marry a lower status woman. She would be a better worker, more hardworking worker, as well as perhaps less demanding. Okay. So here's here's a gender comparison of the role of marriage over time. So on the left, we have these six regression coefficients and standard errors for daughters. That's coming from one regression. And we have seen those already. And on the right, we have the equivalent for sons. And so what we see here is that the gains from marrying into high status families for the sons rises. And that's consistent with the idea that there's a relative shift in terms of the family's investments, the parents of these sons, because it was more and more difficult to essentially invest into education, rise through the civil service exam. So they would move more towards finding one of these in-law families and their daughter that is still relatively rich. Okay, so what I've shown so far is that marriage behavior plays a role for major aspects of women's intergenerational mobility. In particular, the level of mobility accounting for marriage lowers relative mobility estimates by in the order of 20 to 30%. And the sources of mobility, the in-law family accounts for in the order of 30 to 40% of this total intergenerational boost. Now let's turn to the trends. The trends in intergenerational mobility. It turns out that we have on the bottom, if we're only looking at that beta of the biological father, but if I look at the top, I have the result of the beta. It's just the sum of the beta of the biological father and the beta of the in-law father. You see that once we're accounting for marriage, the gender trends between, the intergenerational mobility of father-daughters and of father-sons, it's actually very similar. There's a scale difference because on the left, we have that first wife status variable. That's the daughter correlation. And on the right, we have that standard male status. But the trends is very similar. Okay, so that's also interesting that without accounting for marriage, which is the lower picture, you would not get that the trends are similar. Okay, we can do one more thing, which is we can actually put in information on multi-generational mobility. We can actually identify the paternal and maternal grandfathers of these sons. And if we're doing this, we have a bit of a smaller sample. You see here N is 5,000, not 6,100, because we have one more generational lag. We need to know what status these grandfathers are. But once we do this, we see here comparing columns 1 and 2 that the role of the father-in-law status exceeds that of the paternal grandfather. That's the column 2. The coefficient is 0.27 versus 0.17. And the father-in-law variable is the coefficient, the point estimate is even larger than the sum of the paternal and maternal grandfather combined. So that's additional evidence that marriage is really important in accounting for in studying intergenerational mobility. Now, let me tell you where we fit into the literature here, I think, and we can discuss this. So there's a huge literature on intergenerational mobility in many countries, and the change in intergenerational mobility has been studied in particular since 1850. That exists for pretty much every country in the world, but I've pulled out some for, in particular, the US and China here. These are important studies. Now, if you look at times before the 20th century, then that's pretty much exclusively father-son mobility, because there's no status information on women typically. Now, to the extent that women intergenerational mobility has been studied, then people use approximations or pseudo-links. For example, and an important one, as I already said, is to say that women's status is actually identical to the status of the married husband, but that has the disadvantage that we cannot distinguish biological from marriage intergenerational factors. One can also use the approximation that status has something to do with the first names, or one can look at particular populations, like we can look at relatively rich people, top 10 populations. So what this paper is doing here relative to that is we're looking at relatively long periods of times since the 1500s, really, and we're trying to trace using original data, some kind of information on female status, which is this first wife variable, in order to look at long-run changes in female mobility. Now, second, there's also a huge literature on marital sorting. What are the reasons for marital sorting? Mostly sociologists and economists have contributed to that. It's well understood that this is very closely related to inequality, social stratification. There's studies on 20th century sorting, let's say for the US and China, that I've listed there. And there's even a couple of papers on pre-1900 marital sorting that people have written. Now, closer to what we're really doing is we want to look at how does marital sorting estimates of intergenerational mobility. That's well recognized. There's some work for 20th century samples by Gary Solon and co-authors, for example. And there's some recent work that I just saw at a conference on pre-19th century evidence. Now, what we're doing relative to that is to show that sorting affects women's intergenerational mobility in earlier times than what others have shown in China. And we can actually also see changes over time. And for that, in my view, need a relatively long time period. And the importance of marriage for intergenerational mobility is also coming out by seeing that that marriage is more important in the intergenerational status transmission than biological grandparents, which we can show for males. Last not least, we are increasingly realizing that key social processes rely on intergenerational transmission. So those are long-run processes that have to do with mobility, for one, as I've just studied, but it's not limited to that. Cultural norms, trust, various things like that appear to be, there's increasingly evidence that relies on intergenerational transmission, which means there's a need for intergenerational panel data. Now, we are proposing here with this paper and with a couple of other papers that we've worked on, family genealogies in order to address this. Now, there's a couple of alternative approaches that you can take. In particular, you can there's been a lot of progress, especially on US intergenerational mobility estimation that links censuses across years. So these are US censuses, and that has been automated. So there's a probabilistic approach. We don't try to do this for sure anymore, but probabilistically, then you have link rates of about 16% between different censuses, but it's huge data sets. And so that's a way of making progress. However, you cannot go beyond something like 1850 because that's when the earliest censuses that have real data come out. And for many countries, I think that includes China, censuses only come out in the 20th century. You can also look at special populations. The classic work by Ho Ping Ti has done that. He has a beautiful book on Jinshi and Juran mobility, where they came from and where they go. But that, as I showed you earlier, that accounts for about 2% in a standard, less than 2% in a standard cross-section of Chinese population. So it's not going to give us these commoners. Closest to us in some sense is the usage of other self-reported family data that's done by Naidu and his co-authors. They're studying various surveys on families as opposed to census data, and they get quite different and very interesting estimates on US intergenerational mobility in the early 20th century. Now, other work that uses Chinese family genealogies is studying very long-run phenomenon, including a paper by Che, environmentally induced diseases and development. We have another paper on the fall of Ming and the preference formation and the persistence of shocks, and Hess works on the interface between individual migration, collective institutions using family genealogical data. So I'm out of time. Here's the final slide. Let me try to summarize this. I hope that I've shown some evidence convincing you that the timing of marriage may be indicative of women's status. Marriage is a large part of intergenerational status transmission, in the order of 1/3 of the total. And the in-law family may be even more important than biological grandparents. Marriage is a force towards status persistence. That's because the status of biological and in-law families is positively correlated in the order of about 60%. During this period in China. And we also see marital sorting falling from the early periods to the early 20th century. And accounting for marriage in this analysis that we can do here, it turns out that women's intergenerational mobility trends are quite similar to men's intergenerational mobility trends. That's all I have. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Keller, for introducing this very interesting study. Next, we invite Professor Dong Hao from Peking University, Guanghua School of Management to discuss this study for about 10 minutes. Hao.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen first. Yeah. So can you see that in full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So it's thanks for the invitation from Professor Zhu Chen and Chicheng Ma. That's really a great honor and pleasure to be here, and especially to read and get a chance to talk about the fascinating work by Professor Keller and Professor Shiue. So I enjoyed very much about my homework. So it's not even it's a lot of enjoyment of reading that. And also before I start to talk about this work, and also I think one thing we should definitely recognize is, the dedication of Professor Keller and Shiue, and especially Carol Shiue's kind of contribution to a better understanding of Chinese population history in general. Because if you really read their publication list, first of all, that's a lot, that's long, but also usually at very good reputable journals. And the works are of very high quality that, many of the papers are about Chinese family behaviors, population behaviors, other things in the long run. And those are actually my must read for the students of historical social science and demography and sociology econ majors in my courses. So talking about this paper, I think that's also a very good example of, the long range of the good outputs of the research done by Professor Keller and Shiue. And what you will see is that, there's a lot of very careful examinations in the very beginning, right? So a extensive chunk of time was devoted to convince you or to basically assure you that, this talk about the detailed representativeness or the selection of these materials, because essentially we, as scholars studying the historical work, are facing very similar problems, which means, we are studying an even more imperfect work than the modern work. So we are suffering from different kind of survivorship of registers and data, and what you can study, only those data that survive today. So all kinds of biases, errors, mixed research, way harder than doing that, with modern data. But despite that kind of things, I think for this presentation, that has been quite successfully, assured that at least lay down a very clear picture about what we're talking about. I think that's very important thing to begin with. And also we are dealing with quite different period throughout the Ming-Qing kind of different centuries and different institutions. And those are also, I think I learned a lot from that. And technically, I'm quite a fan of the approach used, especially using percentile rank to measure the status, because essentially for the works recently I've been doing with my colleagues, including some the trends in social mobility in the 20th century in China and the US, and also the trends in educational authoritative mating in China over the past century, like 9 decades. We've been trying to advocating and demonstrating that the rank approach would be a way to go, especially if you are facing some kind of societies that has undergone structural changes and other things, essentially for you to study the long run trends in the developing world. And I also read some other very relevant papers, and I enjoy that and recommend all the interested audience to read, which is another paper by Shiue and Keller that's about marriage matching over the 5 centuries in China. That's a very good companion paper to this one. Okay, so given the limited time, I'll actually focus my discussion on one of the important contributions of this paper, but I think that's one of the most that I'm interested in. I have some reflections on that, which is this very significant novel kind of marriage timing-based status measure for Chinese women in the past, right? So that enables this very fine piece of work. And if you really read the working paper and look at this very informative table in the appendix, so what you can find is this is essentially the coding for the status, right? So we definitely know who is the first wife, but also about the zeros, who are the non-first wife. Actually, that includes different types of wives. So for some, the single wife or only wife, as talked in the presentation, is for the wife that's the only wife for the husband throughout his life, right? And also you have second or subsequent wife and concubines and others. I also got this table from the other working paper I just mentioned by Shiue and Keller. That's an NBER working paper. And for this, what you can see essentially that what's interesting is in the middle, which is at least in these genealogies, if we are talking about second wife, that's largely the second wife when the first has already died. So it's more like a sequential marriage instead of multiple, like polygamy. And that's actually very in line with understanding our understanding about other populations in Imperial China in general, because in the commoners population, it's actually rare to find those polygymies, despite all the myths in the novels that many people are fascinated about. But given that, so if you really, so my reflections on this status measure is that talking about the attainment of this high status or first wife status is conditional or contingent on actually three things. Right. The first thing has already been addressed by Professor Keller in the presentation, which is, first of all, if we think that's a general measure for the status of women, that requires, kind of universality or prevalence, high prevalence of marriage in the population. And that's not an issue, right? Because we are talking about universal marriage, especially for females in the past. And here comes the second thing I think that's very interesting, because the genealogies are looking at life histories retrospectively, right? So after that's done. But if we really think about from the individual life course perspective, actually, and especially, so this to attain a first wife status actually requires mostly first wife's death in this sample, because the majority of the second wife are actually after the death of the first wife. And because that means only until later did we know the wife's final status, whether when she died and her husband remarried, then she becomes the first wife. When she died and the husband remained single or widowed, and then she's still she's not the first wife, but she's the single wife or the only wife, right? And so that, because I think in general, we need to think about the marital sorting or the mate selection as a two-sided matching decision, right? So if we really think about, upon marriage, who are doing this kind of sorting decision? So for the husband and his family, upon each marriage, they may have to decide, whether to marry a wife that's born to a father-in-law of low or high status. That's essentially what they're deciding, given this work. And of course, if that's already the second marriage, then husband knows and the family knows, right? And what's more interesting is from the wife's perspective, and of course, including her families, right? So they actually are making two decisions at a time, and these two are, of course, intercorrelated. One is to marry a husband born to a father-in-law of low or high status. And the second is to be the single wife or only wife, right? Hopefully, because when they get married, or this is already the second marriage of the husband, and you to become the second wife. So in these two things, of course, usually to be the second wife also means kind of marrying up, because usually those only rich or wealthy families will continue and to marry. And if that's the case, so to sum up, so when marrying, neither the husband nor the wife actually could determine if the wife has a high status or not, right? Because this thing is decided retrospectively. So that asked me a little bit of uncomfortable feeling, because the decision and the attainment of status has a long gap. Although it doesn't matter, because we were talking about the national, it's not national, but it's kind of population level kind of estimates of overall mobility. But this kind of timing difference makes me a little bit uncomfortable about measure in general, because that involves different kind of things. And the third thing that the status attainment is conditional on is actually, as I said, you need the husband, the widowed husband, to remarry, right? And there is a selection there. So whether be that they do not have a boy to continue the family line, or they're poor or something, there is a selection. But in that case, I don't think that matters that much. But in general, that means to attain for the first wives, actually that also means partly captures partly the husband's wealth status, because only those, again, so the wealthier families husbands tend to remarry, right, and tend to afford this remarriage. So I think, and so the conclusion would be, you know, to consider the husband's characteristics may also be interesting. And my own curiosity is, what about husband's age at marriage? And it's kind of intuitive in the way that, you know, both the wealth accumulation and the death probability of the wife actually go up when with the husband's aging, right? So, and essentially, given that, you know, most of the women in the past, they marry along at a very young age, and the age window is actually very concentrated. So essentially, we are talking about couples age gap, and that's something I believe in this genealogy is you have information to check. But I mean, whether you think that's relevant or not, I mean, that's we can decide, talk about that later. So here comes my kind of summary. I think, let us not take me wrong that I'm thinking this first wife status measure is not important, but rather the opposite way, which is I think it's actually even more meaningful than just a socioeconomic status measure, because, you know, it includes a lot of things, right? So the early deaths of the first wife, and also captures or correlated with part of the wealth indicator of the husband, of the family, or the father-in-law measured here. So I think it's actually a very important new measure that has been overwhelmingly understudied and utilized in the quantitative history studies about Chinese women. But I think that showcase, you know, indicates well with a lot of information about, you know, this vulnerable dependent life or well-being of women in the past. And I would encourage actually, or I'm keen to read more about the interpretation along that side. So with that, I just conclude my discussion, and thank you, Lau. Yep.
Thank you so much, Professor Dong Hao. Well, Professor Keller, would you like to very quickly respond to Hao's comments?
Yeah, I'd be very glad to do that. Thanks, first of all, for your comments and for your very nice words. That's great. I agree there. I don't really disagree with many of your statements. I think that is correct. We know that almost all, actually, the large majority of these first wives, they are first wives because they die. And so the one thing that I would like to point out, in addition to what you said, is that, you know, from a Becker type viewpoint of an economic theory of marriage, what matters is expectations at the time where the marriage contract is being made. And so the fact that over the lifetime of these people, certain things happen and they die or they don't die, that's not something that will affect the decision making. People say that the age of marriage is between 8 or 10 years of age, and for high status even earlier than that. So yeah, that is, but I see your point. I do also agree that it's very important to get away from status measures that are derived from men, like the socioeconomic status that you mentioned. I totally agree. And so that's one of the reasons of why we're putting this out here. And I realize these limitations. That's what you're correctly saying, what it is. But it's also trying to actually get away from basically not really having information that's original to the status of women. And so we're trying this out. It's sort of useful in particular the Chinese context, because the genealogies list separately every one of these couples, so we can actually check when these particular women were dying, when they were alive. And so we can then see, we should probably do this, we should focus a part of the analysis on first and second wives that have very similar birth years or very far away birth years, and see whether these results are different, something like that.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, great. Thank you both. So in the remaining 5 minutes, let's turn to the questions from our audience. Actually, I found many questions actually have been addressed during Professor Keller's presentation. Now, I just take the liberty to choose one. The question from Elizabeth Singh. Yeah, let me read the question. A basic question: how do you find identifiable women? One, many people in Imperial China did not belong to clans, and fewer in clans that created genealogies. Two, when there was a genealogy, daughters were not recorded, and the names of wives were not given in full. This makes it very difficult to find the same person in other sources. Three, often concubines were not recorded in the genealogy, even when they had produced sons. You must remember you are dealing with a polygamist society. Yes.
Okay, I'm not sure I can answer all of these, and I couldn't even remember all of these, but let me try. But at the outset, let me actually say something more general. So we're working here with a genealogical data set that people have started to work on, and that is a sociologist called Ted Telford in the 1980s. And we have, in the meantime, additionally worked on this data, cleaned it, and developed it some more. And so it's difficult to make comparisons between our data set and what Elizabeth actually knows or has seen in other genealogies. So it's well understood that genealogies, Chinese family genealogies, come in a wide variety of completeness and different. And there's a survey by Telford, for example, that shows across different provinces of China the percentage of vital information that's given, and that ranges from in the order of 30% to 100%. So in that sense, even though there are some kind of similarities and common structures and common purposes, it is not, one doesn't have to expect that the information that's in each of these genealogies is the same. In fact, we know that it's not. So, and that leads me to say that in this particular data, it is possible to see concubines. It is possible to see women that were betrothed only. Marriage was not consummated. I'm not aware of many women that were not part of a clan. That's something that I don't really have heard of much, but I'm definitely aware of the fact that that the genealogy that we're working with here, also given that people have worked on it for a couple of decades, I guess, might not be what's typically out there. Actually, we are proposing to digitize and make accessible to quantitative work more of these genealogies, so that we can make further progress. I guess that's all I can say.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Keller. Well, so now time is already so late on Professor Keller's side. So lastly, Professor Zhu Chen, do you have any comments?
Yeah, thank you, Chen. Thank you, Wolfgang. So I just have one very quick comment or two maybe. First, actually, we are this summer we have been relying on an AI team to try to digitize about 10,000 genealogies. So that will hopefully give us a much larger set of genealogies beyond 7. And next, a very quick related or unrelated question is, so I guess when you talk about intergenerational mobility for women, I guess instead of using the fathers, the aunt, the father-in-law's status. Why don't you use the mother's and grandmother's status, looking at this female line of intergenerational mobility? But I know it's very common in the relevant, in the related literature to focus in the other way. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear about your digitization efforts, and AI is one good way of doing this, probably. Regarding your question about so it's true, we're studying here father-daughter intergenerational mobility. It would be great to study mother-daughter or mother-son intergenerational mobility. That is impossible, unfortunately, because we do not have the status of these mothers. So this is a sort of a asymmetric sample. It is the sample of 135 clans of women marrying into these 7 clans, but there's only the clans don't marry within the clan. We have a very small number of observations where a daughter of one of these 7 clans marries another man also out of these 7 clans, but you can realize this is a very small set. So the problem is fundamentally that we don't really have the status on the mother and the grandmother. Otherwise, we would definitely do it for sure, but we don't know whether they were the first wife in their parental relationship. Otherwise, I think we would do this. One can do, and we've started to work on intergenerational transmission of health by using the age data. So we know how old they get, and so we have started to see some results that actually show that the health of the mother has a higher impact on the health of the son than the health of the father, which maybe is related to, of course, pregnancy and all these things, but it could also be related to so we're doing this for health. One can do a more symmetric approach, but for status, I don't see much of a chance.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Many thanks again to Professor Keller, to Professor Donghao, and also to our audience. Well, our next webinar is scheduled in next Thursday. We are happy to invite Professor Claire Young from the University of Washington to talk about her new study on the relationship between the new groups and the state capacity. We look forward to see you again. See you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you, Hao.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.
Talk to you. See you around.
Yeah.
See you.